Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balkavage, and we are back for another episode of the Thyroid Answers podcast. And today I have two special guests, actually. I have Dr. Aristo Vojdani, and I have a representative from Cyrex. He's like my local representative who helps me out when I have questions, Jim Luzader. How are you doing, guys?
Thank you so much. How about yourself?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm headed to Aruba tomorrow, so I am pumped.
Great.
I spent all day yesterday trying to get my passport renewed at the last possible minute. So you see another side of humanity when you do a rushed passport. Very interesting. And you realize that my life is actually pretty good, if that's the worst you got. So, but I don't want to waste time talking about my trip to Aruba. What I really want to talk about is some of the world of what's going on with the immune system, and there's no better expert, in my opinion, than Dr. Vojdani to kind of talk about the immune system and what's going with the immune system, immunity, autoimmunity, kind of clear up some of the confusion. Dr. Vojdani works intimately with Cyrex Labs, developing the testing. Jim's a representative for that company. It's a company I use. So this isn't a discussion necessarily about their testing, but we'll talk about some of those tests because I think they're really important and I use them in my clinical practice. But I really want to get deep in because so many of our clients struggle with immune, chronic illness, inflammatory issues. And I don't think that they really understand what's going on. So for the listeners, this discussion, we're going to be talking to one of the brightest minds on this topic. So some of this can get heavy. So sometimes we may have to bring it down a little bit and make it super simple, but many times on presentations, he does such a fantastic job keeping it simple that I may not need to do that at all. So Dr. Vojdani, welcome to the Thyroid Answers podcast. Can you give the listeners an idea of who you are and why we should be listening to what you have to say?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on your program. My name is Aristo Vojdani. I am an immunologist with more than 50 years of experience in research and clinical laboratories. I am technical director of Immunosciences Laboratory in Los Angeles, where we do testing for Lyme disease, viral infection, long COVID, and screening for autoimmune diseases. I am also a chief scientific advisor for Cyrex Laboratories, which I had the honor to develop almost all the tests offered by Cyrex Laboratories based on that experience that I had in clinical laboratories for more than 40, 50 years. And Cyrex is located in Phoenix, Arizona. And we are going to talk more about Cyrex testing during our conversation. I am a clinical professor at the Department of Preventive Medicine at Loma Linda University, where with my colleagues, we are teaching about principles of functional medicine, special course for medical students at Loma Linda University. I did publish more than 200 articles in scientific journals, and I'm going to stop there because we want to get really to the science and talk more about the science.
Well, I think what that points out is that you've been around the block a little bit and you probably know what you're talking about. So I think when it comes to in the space of functional medicine, I think a lot of people look at Dr. Vojdani as kind of a go-to source when it comes to what's going on with the immune system and autoimmune conditions. And so I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast, and we're going to kind of get right into it. When we talk about the immune system and we talk about autoimmunity, I think we kind of undersell the amount of people that are struggling with immune and autoimmune related conditions. Why do you think in the last, I'd say 2 decades, 3 decades, it seems like we've had an explosion of autoimmune disorders?
First of all, let's look at the causes of autoimmune diseases. When we talk about autoimmune diseases, for example, because my mother had rheumatoid arthritis, as soon as I go to a doctor and talk about complain about something, immediately he asked me what your mother had, what your father had, and then based on that, right away they make the judgment, it is your gene responsible for pain that you have in your knees. That may be correct or may not be correct, but unfortunately they do not pay attention to the environmental factors that I have been exposed during my lifetime that are responsible for development of immune and autoimmune disorders. One of the reasons, in my opinion, is that we are having more autoimmune diseases because we are more exposed on a yearly basis, on daily basis, on monthly basis to many toxic environmental chemicals, but altogether, I put that in one of my articles as the exposome factor. So I believe the exposome factor is responsible for the rise of inflammation and autoimmunity, neurodegenerative, and neuroautoimmune disorders.
So let's talk about what the exposome is, because I agree with you that, but for the listener, we're going to explain what the exposome is, but this is going to go into a lot to what I talk about quite a bit on the podcast, what I talk about in the book is the load. When we talk about what's triggering us to go from normal manufacturing physiology, low stress, homeostatic manufacturing physiology to excessive stress, cell danger physiology. Everybody's looking for the thing that often triggers it, but really what he's talking about is the load. So go into that a little bit more. What's the exposome? Because people are often looking for the thing, right? The one thing, and it's rarely ever the one thing, in my opinion.
The definition of exposome is the lifetime exposure to the external and the internal environmental factors. As simple as that, but it is very complicated. The external environmental factors, three major ones, are toxic chemicals, food, pathogens, and of course, their effect on our gut microbiome. Now, stress also could be external environmental factor, but will have effect also on the immune system. But there are also many internal factors, for example, protein modification, methylation, acetylation. When the proteins get modified, that is called the internal factor. But really, what is the cause of citronellation? Because I'm mentioning that especially because that's a test rheumatologists are using for diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis by measuring antibodies against citronylated proteins, meaning certain proteins in our body, one amino acid changes from arginine to citrulline, just one amino acid. That by itself is going to make our self protein to look to our immune system as non-self. And then the immune system is going to attack that, results in anti-citronylated antibody production. But the question is, why our proteins get citronylated, methylated, acetylated, and there are thousands of those? The answer is something from the external environment get into our body and makes that protein to become citronylated. And classical and simple example of that is cigarette smoking. If cigarette smoking can do that, then formaldehyde can do that. If cigarette smoke can do that. There are thousands and thousands of other chemicals. As you know, there are close to 100,000 different chemicals that been introduced into our environment and probably into our body in the past probably 80 years. And so therefore we have to pay attention mainly to the external environment, because they also play a role in changing our proteins, which I call those the internal factors.
So for the listeners, I mean, it's important to understand that we're bombarded chronically, and I'm gonna hit on this in a second, but we're all bombarded by it, right? So now you're hearing that it's the chemicals in our environment, it's potentially the foods, it's all these things. So somebody might be like now in panic mode, like, okay, now I got to live in a bubble so I can prevent myself from being exposed to those things. It's not quite as simple as just because you have an exposure, you're automatically going to have chronic illness, but it becomes part of the load. So we're talking about foods, we're talking about toxins, we're talking about what's in your water, we're talking about what's in your air. And we're talking about then what happens internally too. What happens once that stuff gets in there, it changes what's going on, and that can trigger inflammatory mechanisms that activate this kind of cell danger physiology. And I wouldn't mind getting your opinion, because we also see those are the things that we can often kind of see. We can measure the foods, we can measure the toxins, we can measure the organisms and our response to those. But I think we could also say that there's some other factors that could also trigger that kind of chronic inflammatory response that could trigger things. Maybe things like trauma, things like a lot of excessive emotional stress, disordered breathing can have an impact on stressing our physiology. Disrupted sleep patterns can have a significant impact on our physiology and push us into that danger mode. While we can't necessarily measure for immune reaction to those things, would you agree that those things too could be part of that web of things, the things that create the load that create the problem, whether it's directly or indirectly?
I agree 100%. That's why the definition of exposome is about external and the internal. And some of those, like sleep disturbance, its effect is internal. Will have effect on the internal body. So therefore, yes, all of those, all the above, we call those exposome.
Yeah, and so I read an article that talked about the network, and it was written by an allopathic physician, and so they were talking about the network of how these systems, the immune system, the microbiome, how all these systems are interconnected, and that if the future of medicine is going to be figuring out how to address this interconnected web. And I sat back and I thought, man, this sounds like functional medicine they're talking about. Yeah. So I think I think maybe it's really a good thing. And with your background, you may say, hey, you're kind of biased to this. And I think I do have a bias. I came from the medical world. Now I'm in this functional medicine space. But what I think sometimes is the challenge, even in functional medicine, is we have an allopathic paradigm, right, which is really great at acute care, disease management, but it's not really great at getting to sometimes those root cause issues. And we see that kind of trickling into functional medicine. The paradigm or the philosophy is the same, but we see people just trying to do it differently with supplements instead of drugs. And drugs, honestly, drugs can have a more potent effect initially. But do you think that the way you're looking at stuff, do we think that this is more, I don't know, I don't want to say more in line with functional medicine. I think it's kind of more in line with what we're trying to do from functional medicine. But do you think allopathic medicine is leaning more, seeing this is becoming more mainstream, this kind of whole network, genetics plus the exposome concept?
At the level of research, I think there is a lot. There's a lot has been done. And let me give you an example that I just, a month ago, I came back from a 13th International Congress of Autoimmunity. The years before, which is every 2 years, and this one was in Athens, in Greece. This time we're about 1,000 scientists from all over the world. And one day of the 3 days was devoted to the mosaic of autoimmunity. And the mosaic of autoimmunity, for example, they were talking about silicone breast implant and autoimmunity, infection and autoimmunity, toxic chemicals and autoimmunity, food and autoimmunity, COVID and autoimmunity. So now, even at that level, I used to talk about mold exposure and inflammation and autoimmunity 25 years ago. I published a lot in that field. And also, I published a lot about silicone breast implant and other implants causing inflammation and autoimmunity. And now it's beautiful to see that scientists from all over the world do research and present that to the others to learn more about this. How long will it take this information to go to the mainstream and will accept that silicone can, this is just example, whether it's silicone or bisphenol A, plasticizers, that causing autoimmunity, acting as adjuvant. Unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic about that and may take 30 years in order to get to that level.
Yeah. And so I think I agree. I think it's going to take a little bit more time. I think it's that machine moves slow, but I think we're starting to see, when I read papers like that, hey, this is there, man, all this stuff is connected. It gives me hope that we're going to start looking at this. It's probably more from, instead of looking at a thyroid, instead of looking at a gut, instead of looking at different tissues and saying, hey, we need different specialists to take a look at each of these because these are separate systems, we start to realize that all these systems kind of work in conjunction. And I often explain to my patients when they have a chronic immune, chronic inflammatory, cell danger type physiology going on, they say, but I have an adrenal problem, I have a thyroid problem, I have a gut issue. I said, yeah, those should be expected. When your cells are behaving from a danger perspective, they're going to downregulate the metabolism, not by accident, but often on purpose to slow down the growth, the manufacturing of peptides that organisms could use to reduce the oxidative stress. Because if you keep the mitochondria going at full function, now you've got oxidative stress from the mitochondria. Now you have an organism, you get oxidative stress from that. Now you definitely overwhelm the glutathione production in the antioxidant system, and now you have issues. So we see a lot of what goes on physiology is adaptive downregulation of systems, so we can shift energy and attention towards upregulating the most important thing in the moment, which is cell defense, right? The inflammatory process in cell defense. So they should expect that they're going to start to see some changes in their thyroid physiology. You should expect to see some changes in gut physiology. They should expect to see this multi-system adaptive disorder start to develop as they start to be in this chronic inflammatory immune-driven state for an extended period of time. Does that make sense from your perspective?
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's take example of gut microbiome. If really you go online and look at how many articles published in past 5 years about gut microbiota and health, I think the number is going to be probably to be close to 1 million. I didn't do that, but if you do that, I'm sure it's going to be overwhelming number of articles that published in the past 5 years. But it happened that I talked to young medical students, and when I talk about gut microbiome and their relationship to body physiology, autoimmune diseases, inflammation, and many more, and sometimes they start laughing. And so it is a little bit disappointing that that because not only just students, the many MDs who do not have time to go online or to library, the open access journals, to read some of these articles, then in order to, just because they are not ready to say that, sorry, I did not read these articles, just it's very easy to say.
Well,
that-
I think the default becomes it's an autoimmune condition. There's nothing we can do about it, right?
Exactly.
We don't know
Yes.
what it is. It's
Yes.
idiopathic. And
Yeah.
when my patient says, what does idiopathic mean? I usually say the idiot who gave you the diagnosis is not going to spend any time looking for what it might be, but that's okay. And that's a kind of a mean way to say it, but really that doesn't help a client, a person out who's struggling. They want to know, why do I have it? And it's really what I think we should be doing in functional medicine, is helping that person identify it. So that's exactly what Cyrex tests and the tests you developed has helped us understand why what are the things that may be triggering immune processes and what tissues might be impacted. But I think
it's very easy for them to dismiss it.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't exist. But we are really lucky that we have functional medicine that started, I remember that 1992, 1993 with Dr. Bland. I was one of the first 20 people who we started in Seattle, all of this, that now it's flourished to this level. Yeah. Now we are, talking about personalized medicine, which is the next level of functional medicine.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy that we have people like Jeffrey Bland and functional medicine and doctors who are practicing functional medicine that can help the patients to get to the root cause of the diseases. And as I mentioned in my article, that we have to pay attention to the early events happen in our body that are responsible for changing our physiology, resulting in inflammation, autoimmunity, neurodegenerative disorders.
Yeah, and I think it's why I tell my clients, and I talk about it on the podcast as well, is that somebody's story, their timeline, when I ask them for the timeline, their health history from birth to now, some people put a lot of effort into it. Some people don't put much effort into it all, but that tells us a story of how we got here often. You may not realize that the things that happened to you, the antibiotics you took early on, the diet you had, that all these things change the immune system, have an impact on the immune system, change the biome, which has an impact on the immune system, but that's your story. And that becomes critical to actually improving your health and your well-being. So what often happens, and you would know this better than anybody, somebody gets diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, whether it's Hashimoto's or something else, and they think their problem started when they got the diagnosis. Like, I just got Hashimoto's, or whatever their diagnosis. I'm like, no, your immune system and your gut flora has probably been dysfunctional for an extended period of time. It took a while for this process to often kick in. And if we go back and look at their health history and their story, you can all go, yeah, you were already having problems 5 years ago. We're just seeing the antibody and the immune effect currently. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that. And again, it is unfortunate that when patients, they show early signs of inflammation and autoimmunity, because they do not fit with the criteria inside the box based on, let's say, College of the American Rheumatologists, or classification for lupus, or this or that. They do not treat the patient because they don't know. Based on that criteria, the patient doesn't have classical autoimmune disease, and therefore they wait until all the tests and all the symptoms to be in place, and then they'll start treating the patient, which is too late, in my opinion. That's the difference between functional medicine and the other part of the medicine.
Yeah. So, for the listeners, one of those things that is a great example of this, since this is the Thyroid Answers podcast, is what's going on with, let's talk about, because I always talk about cellular physiology and cellular hypothyroidism, which I think happens as an adaptive response to that excessive cell stress. I don't think the thyroiditis is often cases the beginning of the problem. I think that the diagnosis of primary hypothyroidism is the end stage, because we've lost about 90% of the gland by the time we're often diagnosed. But a great example of this is that a lot of times people, when I'm meeting with people, they're like, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism, but I don't have Hashimoto's. They don't think they have an immune-driven problem because their antibodies aren't positive. And we're going to get into the immune system here in a second. I'm going to have you do a little precursor, but they're like, no, I don't have an immune issue. I just have hypothyroidism. I'm like, listen, you live here in the United States, you live in the modern world. If you have a thyroid condition, it's probably triggered by thyroiditis. And the issue is, it's still immune driven. It's still autoimmune. It's the difference. It's still Hashimoto's.
Yes.
The issue is you just haven't seen the antibodies yet because your immune system is not producing a lot of those antibodies. And we'll talk about Th1, Th2 and how the immune system can shift. But do you think that's like a great example of somebody saying, hey, this isn't an immune system issue. This is just a hypothyroid condition, when in reality, the vast majority of the cases are driven by the lymphocytes coming in there and damaging the gland?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I agree with that.
So let's get back to the immune system. So somebody's sitting at home, they say, hey, I just got diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. Can you give like a brief, simple example of the body gets exposed to a toxin, an organism, and it trigger, how does the body react? Let's use an organism. How does the body react to it naturally? And then we'll do a second scenario where it might trigger or result in an autoimmune condition. So how would what are the cells, because you guys do a fantastic test called the lymphocyte map test. So I want to talk a little bit about the different types of those things, but how does the immune system work? Why doesn't everybody have an autoimmune condition? Because we're bombarded by stuff.
Thank you. So let's take example. Usually when we talk about the immune system, we take classical example of infection, pathogen. In this case, let's take COVID. As soon as we get exposed to a virus, and the virus managed to go through, I call it the IRS system, infect, replicate, and spread. Because if we have a strong immune system, that should not happen, first of all. Infect may happen, but replicate and spread depends on the strength of the immune system. And so our first line of defense, dendritic cells or macrophages, will take up that virus. And because the virus is, although it's a very small, microscopical, but it has thousands of proteins, the macrophages have to break it down to smaller pieces called antigen. For example, spike protein is one antigen. Nucleoprotein is another antigen. So they take that and even cut it to smaller peptides. The macrophages, now they take that peptide, present it to another type of cells called T helper cells.
And the T helper cells, let me just jump in here. So a macrophage is a type of white blood cell, right?
Correct.
So we have neutrophils that you'll see on your blood report. You'll see monocytes, and we're talking about monocytes and macrophages. These things are very similar. The difference is the monocytes in the blood, the macrophage, that dendritic cell, is inside the tissue, right?
Yes, and now we have lymphocyte.
And the lymphocyte is a type of white blood cell, and it's got a couple different categories. So it's got T cells, you got B cells, and then you got these other kind of thing that's in the mix there that's called your natural killer cells. Can you describe what each of those is?
Correct. So now this is the macrophage, takes the antigen and presenting it to, we call them naive T cell.
Yep.
So this communication between the two results in production of some molecules called cytokines. That's kind of growth factors of the immune system. For example, if they produce interferon gamma, some IL-2, they activate a type of white blood cells to become or have the specialty of going after the virus and kill the virus. That is called cytotoxic lymphocyte. Okay, so at the same time, the helper cells after the presentation, depending on what kind of cytokines they're producing, whether it's Th1 or Th2, they communicate with other type of cells. For example, with B cells, the B cells become plasma cells, and their job is to manufacture antibodies. And now, if cytotoxic lymphocyte was not able to go after the virus and destroy the virus, now the antibody will bind to the viral antigens and neutralize the virus. And so there are several levels of protection against these viruses. So number one, the macrophages, because they break down the virus to make the antigen.
So the neutrophils, the monocytes, macrophages, those are like the first line of defense.
Correct.
And then they start trying to first line of defense. They get little pieces of the threat, and then they take it back to the let's say to the antigen presenting cells, right? Yeah. And they say, hey, this is the thing that's creating the problem, or this is the tissue that's being damaged. And you may have, and those naive T cells, right? These naive cells that you were talking about, they're like teenage boys, right? They really don't know what they want to be, but some of those boys may go off to be and immediately start fighting. Some of those naive T cells may turn into antibody stimulating type cells, right? And stimulate the body to start this manufacturing process and make antibodies towards the organism and potentially towards our own tissue, right?
Yes. So after the antigen presentation, the CD4 cell or helper cells, they get specialty. Some become Th1, some become Th2, some become regulatory T cell or Th3, some become Th17, and we have many more, also Th9 and follicular T helper cells. So each one of these have special task to protect us against foreign materials. And against the viruses, we have four line of defenses. Was macrophages, we have the cytotoxic lymphocytes, we have the natural killer cells. So some of them are part of the innate immune system, some of them part of the adaptive immune system, and of course, the antibody is part of the adaptive immune system. So if those three line of defenses were not able to destroy the virus, now the antibody is going to complete the job.
So innate immune response, is it fair to say like the innate immune response it's not really looking for any initial help. It's just going out there and doing it. The adaptive immune response is more like, okay, tell me exactly what you want me to go for. It's actually making specific things like maybe a blind mercenary versus somebody who's got really targeted response, right?
Yes, the innate immune response is unconditional.
Right, it's just going, right?
And by the way, almost every living system, I'm saying that even, when I was doing my postdoc at UCLA, even I worked on the immune system of earthworms. Do you know that earthworms, which are invertebrates, they have first line of defense. They have phagocytes. They can do phagocytosis. And so therefore, that first part of the innate immune system, which is phagocytosis and destroying the enemy, it is almost with every single living system. But in mammalian system becomes the most complete, which, we have several levels of innate immune system and we have several levels of adaptive immune system.
So then this is all complex stuff. So I don't want to go too far, but I want to cover a couple terms that people might see or hear and so they can differentiate them. So we have the T cells, we have the B cells. Within the T cells, we talk about Th1 and Th2. Can you explain to the listeners, because I'm sure they've heard this or read it on a blog or watched a video somewhere, what's the difference between Th1 and Th2? Do they both stimulate the production of antibodies? Does one do something different than the other one? From a simple term that somebody might understand, what's the significance?
I think the Th1 are major components of cell-mediated immunity. They produce different cytokines, communicate with other components of the immune system. The Th2 are important in secretion of antibodies, secretion of cytokines, that those cytokines activating the B cells to become plasma cells and produce antibodies. And that's why we say Th2 is responsible for antibody production. If a person which is Th2 dominant will have more allergies and hypersensitivities. Why? Because IgE antibody, which is responsible for allergy, is initiated, its production being initiated by Th2 cells, which activated the B cells under abnormal conditions to produce significant amount of IgE, which results in allergy. Now,
go ahead.
So this is Th1 and this is Th2, okay? Cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity or antibody-mediated immunity. Now, in the middle, there is a policeman that balancing Th1 and Th2. That cell, it's called regulatory T cell or Th3 cell. The job of regulatory T cell is to regulate the immune system, keep the immune system in homeostatic state.
Yeah.
And so therefore, from a practical point of view, it's extremely important to keep our regulatory T cell functional in order to maintain balance between Th1 and Th2. Th17 job is to help get rid of intracellular microorganisms. That's their job. But unfortunately, when they become overactivated due to some of the exposomal factors, the external and the internal environmental factors, when they become overstimulated, they produce all kind of inflammatory cytokines. And then now Th17 is going to attack our own tissue that could result in autoimmunity. The same thing Th1, both of them are Th1 and Th17 are part of the cell-mediated immunity. When they become overactivated due to environmental factors, they produce all kinds of factors that can damage our tissue, including thyroid tissue, that then release of tissue antigen result in antibody production against our own self antigens. Now, I would like to go back to that level of antigen presenting cell and T helper cells. And then they become Th1, Th2, regulatory T cell, Th17, and more.
Mm-hmm.
What is going to determine that each one of these cells will be divided in correct proportion? Obviously, our lifestyle, our diet, our mental alertness, many other factors, physical activity, all of that can affect this communication between macrophages and naive T cell to become Th1, Th2, Th3, and so forth.
Yeah.
So the exposome factor is the one.
Yeah. So it's the, yeah.
And therefore, some individual may have this proportional of Th1 and Th17 And now Th1, Th17, after years of being in the blood, and then a virus comes along, attacking thyroid tissue, opening the gate, now Th1 and Th17, like Pac-Man, get into the thyroid tissue, start eating up the thyroid tissue. Now thyroid peroxidase, thyroglobulin, and other tissue antigens are released. Now we are going to make TG and TPO antibodies. So who is responsible for development of all these thyroid antibodies? And what should we do about it? We have to detect the early events responsible for these antibody production.
All right, so I got to slow you down right there because I got a list of questions because I think this is really important things here for people to listen to what he said. So when we talk about what's going on here and we talk about autoimmunity a lot, and we talk about, do I have an immune issue? Do I not have an immune issue that's driving it? What he's talking about here is that the immune cells themselves are going into the thyroid gland and creating the damage. The antibodies may or may not occur while this is going on. You could have full-on thyroiditis that's it's immune driven. What we don't know is what's driving, and that's different for potentially everybody. But the immune system is driving the damage. We've been taught, and I was taught that, and you see this over and over again, that the antibodies are like little Pac-Man eating away the thyroid gland. But in the papers I'm reading, especially the more recent papers, they're saying the thyroglobulin antibodies don't cause any damage to the gland. The TPO antibodies cause very little damage to the gland. It's the immune cells that are going in there that are causing the bulk of the damage. So if you're looking at this and saying, hey, my antibodies I don't have normal antibodies, so I don't have an immune issue, you do have an immune issue probably, but your antibodies are negative, because what he said was when you're Th1, if you're more Th1 and or Th17 dominant, you're going to have a ton of thyroiditis going on, or inflammation or damage to a tissue, but not show antibodies. But if you're Th2 dominant, you're going to you might have a greater propensity of excessive antibody production. And so what I've seen, especially after running a whole bunch of the lymphocyte panels and just looking at patients, is they go, I don't have an autoimmune condition because my antibodies are negative, but they got thyroiditis and they've got tissue hypothyroidism and they got glandular hypothyroidism. And then as they're actually functioning better, their thyroid conversion is working better, their signs and symptoms are going away, you're seeing their T3 and free T3 return to normal levels without trying to manipulate it with selenium or anything. And you're going, okay, and I'm feeling a function, but now you actually start to see antibodies maybe crop up where they weren't there before. And now they're thinking, well, now I have an autoimmune condition. And in my opinion, it's really the immune system starting to balance itself out. How would you discuss that?
Yes, definitely. But I would like also your audience to learn that the immune abnormalities happens many years before the antibody production. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, when you go to a functional medicine doctor and they do testing for lymphocyte subpopulation, the lymphocyte map by Cyrex, and they find out based on the results that you are having too many Th1, too many Th17, and sometimes even too many natural killer cells. Based on that, they can do something about it, bring back everything to balance and homeostasis, and that way they will prevent future development of autoimmune disease, such as thyroid autoimmunity.
And so when you were talking about these naive T cells, they could turn into a bunch of different types of cells. And how does it know what to do? This is where I go back to the teenage boy scenario. Think about a teenage boy, very pliable, you can really influence them in a different direction. And so based on what's going on, what's that exposome, what's pushing, what's the load on your system, emotional stress, bad marriage, I got a chronic food sensitive, like I'm eating crappy food, I'm not sleeping at night, right? All these things are the things that are telling those naive T cells, hey, we need more of these. We need more of these. We've got more organism in here, and that's what's driving it. So when we're looking at, you may not have antibodies yet, but you may not even have any diagnosis yet. But the Cyrex does have a test called a lymphocyte map test. We can look at if you're starting to not feel so good, but there's no obvious things, and we can see the imbalance in the immune system. That's where we can look at that and say, hey, something's pushing your immune system out of balance. And if we don't address it, yeah, you don't have a diagnosable pathology yet, but it's probably only going to be a matter of time. Would you agree to that?
Yes. Let me add or interject terminology in here. There is something in the immune system. It's called plasticity of the immune system. What we right now talked about, that naive T cells become Th1, Th2, and that's plasticity of the immune system. And that plasticity of the immune system is going to be affected by the exposomal factors.
Yep. So for the listeners, what's that mean? That means if I have let's go back to our teenage boy. If I have a teenage boy and he's hanging around a bunch of kids doing drugs all the time, guess what? He may start doing drugs, and you may say, well, why is he doing it? He's got this good life. Because it's the people that he's surrounding himself with that are influencing him that are going to determine that he does that. But you put that same teenage boy in a different situation with a bunch of people who are, athletes or people who are very driven or all Boy Scouts or something like that, they may turn out totally differently because of the influence. So everything we do has a major impact on our physiology. And the last point on this before I dig in a little bit more is we talked about the immune system balance. You had your arms out there like this scale. You got the T regulatory cells trying to balance this thing. Why this is so important for people who especially have immune and autoimmune conditions is your immune system there is trying to maintain a balance between the threats that are coming in and manage those threats, but not be overactive, right? So if we're overactive against every organism that comes in, then we lose the balance on the other side where we start to lose tolerance maybe to our own tissues excessively, right? Because we always have tissue that's being damaged, and we go, okay, that's mine. That's mine. That's our stuff. It's not a big deal. But if we have this excessive immune response, now it's hyperactive to everything, right? And then the immune system, if it starts teetering the other way, where it becomes underfunctional, now all of a sudden you're the person who's chronically ill. You don't have much in the way, maybe of I never get sick, but I have chronic illness, right? Because you have a lot of organisms that have gotten past the barrier into the system. They're thriving, creating chaos, but you never respond to it appropriately. You might not have any food sensitivities, food intolerances, because guess what? Your immune system is compromised to a point. Now, that's not always the case. We often see problems, but would you agree with some of those points?
Very, very well said. This cell is responsible for maintaining immune tolerance, meaning that under normal condition, our immune system should not react to self-tissue proteins, only should react to non-self, foreign materials. But unfortunately, when the environmental factors bind to human tissue proteins, then our self proteins being recognized by the immune system as not self, and then will attack that, results in antibody production. Let me give you a simple example of food. And this is in one of my books, that let's take peanuts. Peanuts contain lots of aflatoxin. That's very well known. Now, if we eat pure peanuts, that our digestive enzymes will break down completely the proteins of peanuts. From proteins become peptides to amino acids and then we get energy source. But if aflatoxin is bound to some of these proteins, obviously the digestive enzymes will not be able to break down completely that protein to amino acids. Now we'll have many peptides in the gut. The peptides in the gut causing inflammation, leaky gut, and leaky gut results in entry of now undigested food protein, and then results in immune reaction and antibody production against aflatoxin and peanut proteins. Now think that if that peanut protein is peanut agglutinin, peanut agglutinin also cross-reacts like many other agglutinins, germ agglutinins, lectins and agglutinins in general, cross-react with thyroglobulin or thyroid peroxidase. Now that could result in autoimmunity against thyroid tissue, and which we detect the antibody in the blood. So this is another mechanism from completely different direction. Why? Because regulatory T cell also keeping tolerance against food, not just tolerance against our tissue, not to react against our self-tissue, but also the food that we eat. So any abnormalities at the level of regulatory T cell, when cannot keep this balance between Th1 and Th2, as you mentioned, results in allergy, hypersensitivity, and autoimmunity.
Yeah, and we're going to get a little bit more into it. We're going to talk about organisms and the gut biome, because for the listeners, what goes on in your GI tract, we talk about bile physiology, or at least I do. We talk about short chain fatty acids and the importance of these things to help regulate the immune system. And about, I don't know, it's what, 70% of the immune system surrounds the GI tract. And so if you've got a major force of the immune system around the GI tract, and the things that help regulate those T regulatory cells, like help stimulate those Treg cells and help kind of manage them so they're appropriate, if those things are missing, then the T regulatory system isn't working efficiently. And now that immune system can go haywire one way, one direction or the other.
Definitely. We have the very high number of regulatory T cells in the gut tissue.
Mm-hmm.
And it is quite interesting that these cells, regulatory T cells, they have receptor for toxic chemicals, and they have receptors for dietary components. And that receptor called AHR, aryl hydrocarbon receptor. So if we get exposed to certain toxic chemicals and bind to that receptor on Treg cells, obviously the Treg cell is going to be dysfunctional. Then we lose a tolerance mechanism. But with good nutrition and diet, this is 2-3 classical examples. That receptor is very important for vitamin A. Vitamin A is bind to that receptor on Treg cells. Vitamin D binds to that receptor on Treg cells. Indole tricarbinol from cruciferous vegetables. And then some of the gut microbiome that they produce acetate, butyrate, and propionate.
Short chain fatty acids.
Yes, they have receptor on Treg cells. So here, classical example. How can we manipulate this for better or worse? Exposure to toxic chemicals break down our tolerance mechanism, may result in autoimmunity, but good nutrition and diet lifestyle exactly can do the opposite and help us to maintain our tolerance mechanism and prevent autoimmunity. All
right, so now you made me think of two new questions as when you just said that, right? So because people will go, well, if if it's the immune system, maybe I just need to consume more vitamin D, which we're telling people right now is, hey, everybody should be taking like 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 IUs of vitamin D. And I have a concern about that because we always think of everything as like it's only one thing. There's no downside to doing it. But because you said the vitamin A also plays a role there, plus we know what it does inside the cells with the RXR receptors, right? Retinoic acid receptors are key to a whole bunch of signaling inside the cell. And there's some discussion that when you do higher doses of vitamin D, you can reduce the absorption of vitamin A in the system. So what's your thought and feeling, if you don't mind, like, should everybody just be bombing tons of vitamin D with no concern as to what their vitamin A status is?
Thank you for asking that. Absolutely not. At the level of International Congress of Autoimmunity, majority of those who spoke about vitamin D, they recommended 2,000 units every day. I personally take 5,000 units, but not more than that. That is, to me, I think the real dose will be somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000. What is your opinion? But too much, not always is good.
Yeah. And I think the issue is, for me, I like to take a look at multiple factors. One of those things, and part of that's controversial, but in reading the works of Douglas Kell, Megan Manchin, and others, we take a look at what's going on with 25-OHD, which is what the only thing is that we often measure. And we say, oh, because it's low, we're all deficient. But we can't make that judgment call, because what do you need? Where's most of the vitamin D we get? That comes from the sun, right? Then that vitamin D from the skin needs to get to the liver to be converted into 25-OHD. And what do we need to do that? We need magnesium. And then once you have 25-OHD at the liver, now we have to say, okay, now what are we going to do with this stuff? Well, we assume that it's all, that's the thing that's the most important, but 25 vitamin D can go into the fat cells, and then that can be converted into 125 vitamin D and have an impact there. And I think this is in human studies, they can't do that. But when they took rats and got rid of their vitamin D receptors in the fat cells, those rats could not get fat. Interesting, right? We also know that 25 vitamin D has to be activated. It's the 125 vitamin D that does all the work. And it looks like the literature shows that when we have this upregulation of the immune system, we take the 25 vitamin D and activate it to the 125, and then the 125 reciprocally inhibits the production of the 25-OHD. So many times when we see a low 25 vitamin D, my opinion, based on the literature I've seen, I want to see what the 125 vitamin D is, because I want to see, is the reason I have this chronically low vitamin D because I'm in this activated state, and maybe I shouldn't keep pounding it away. And then I will take a look at some of the other things like iron regulation and say, okay, do I have a problem here with iron regulation that I may be causing because I'm trying to pound this person with vitamin D, and that's really creating other impacts. So it may be different from your standpoint, but like, we're all entitled to like that thought process. But can you describe how maybe that vitamin D, the 125 vitamin D, how does that influence those immune cells we talked about before, the B cells, the T cells, the Th1, the Th2, the Treg?
Thank you. So last year, vitamin D made it on the cover of Nature Medicine. Mm-hmm. And I use that in some of my presentations. And the cover of the Nature Medicine, they're showing that 3-hydroxy, I think vitamin C, vitamin D, and then there is an enzyme, I forgot the name. There's an enzyme that converts that to metabolites. And so we don't know really. Each one of us may have different level of that enzyme. But let's say if we have optimal amount of that enzyme, and we getting all those good metabolites. The metabolites of vitamin D upregulating Treg cells, downregulating Th1 and Th17. And this is huge for autoimmune diseases.
So based on the individual, we need to make a call versus just everybody we pound the system? Because what if they are Th2 dominant and they already have a suppressed Th1 system? Is that the right process?
No, I think, that's why personalized medicine, personalized treatment is the real answer based on exactly the mechanism we just talked about.
Yeah, and we're not, even from a vitamin D standpoint, we look at one piece. We don't often, it's 125 is often not written, but we also don't also measure the deactivated forms, right? The 124, the 2425 OHD, the 12425 20 OHD. So we're not seeing like what's happening to this 25 vitamin D. We just say it's low. And then a recent paper I just read, you start to say, okay, wait a second. So if 125 is upregulated, what does that do? Well, part of what it does is helps support the immune system, as you said, but that also helps calcium absorption, right? So it helps pull calcium, right, out of the bone, out of the GI tract. So then we should be looking at their calcium level and saying, but their calcium's normal. Then you have to ask one more question. If calcium's normal in that situation, where is the calcium going, right? Yes. Because I got this high 125, and then you go, okay, oh, that 125 OHD can even help stimulate the drive of more calcium into a cell. Is that good or bad? Well, what does the more excessive calcium inside the cell do? That excessive calcium upregulates oxidative stress. Wait a minute. Is that what we want to do? I don't know. Right. So that's where, this is for the listeners, I'm geeking out here a little bit with Dr. V, but the issue is, this is why some of this stuff is so complex. It's not as simple as, oh, I'm just going to go gluten-free, or, oh, I'm just going to take vitamin D. And then, hey, it worked for my friend, it doesn't work for me. Or I took it and I didn't feel well. I'm allergic to this vitamin D. No, you're not allergic to it. What it is you're putting a nutrient into your system, wanting it to do one thing, but your cells and tissues are going to do with it what is the most important for cell survival. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. If you don't mind, I would like to move on.
Sure.
Into the three major environmental factors that play a role in development of thyroid autoimmunity.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, because I did prepare lots of articles in front of me.
Oh,
and if it's a little bit sophisticated, again, between us, we are going to simplify that.
You got it.
So, number one, I wanted to add the issue of toxic chemicals and its role in thyroid autoimmunity. And so here I have an article in front of me, just for the purpose and for the simplicity. We read the title of the article. Okay, I'm reading now. This is an article published in 2002. Thyroid hormonal activity of flame retardants, tetrabromobisphenol A, which is very similar to bisphenol A, and tetrachlorobisphenol A. And conclusion, these results suggest that tetrabromo and tetrachlorobisphenol A act as thyroid hormone agonists as well as estrogens. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what this article is talking about.
So when you say thyroid agonist, let people know what that means, right? So what does that mean? Because the listener is going to go, I don't even know what that means. So what does that mean, thyroid agonist?
Acts like the thyroid hormones.
There you go. So you could have, with toxic chemicals, those toxic chemicals could potentially make you have more hyperthyroid type physiology as a result of being exposed to these things. Now, let me ask you a question on that, because I think a lot of people think, well, it's only the chemical impacting the thyroid gland, but it really, what goes on, if you have if you're exposed to a chemical, right, it could be exposure at the gland itself that could trigger problems, thyroiditis and issues, but you could have exposure to, in the whole physiology, damaging another tissue, and that exposure could also potentially trigger activation of thyroiditis, even though that chemical is maybe not at the gland. Is that possible?
Yes, the chemicals, first of all, can act on the immune system. That's very well established. So now patient is Th1 and Th17 dominant already and get more exposed. Additional factors, viruses, damaging the thyroid gland, and now the chemicals also can get into chemicals plus Th1, Th17, everything together. But again, the chemicals can bind to the receptor and thyrocytes and interfere with the self hormones. And therefore, the real hormones cannot bind to the receptor and thyrocytes. Now, the real body hormones are replaced by toxic chemicals. And so therefore, that's why we call those endocrine disruptors.
So we've got chemicals that can be an issue. What's number two of the things that can really drive that autoimmunity?
So let me finish with this.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
First and then. So with Dr. Karazian, we did this research, and it was published in journal called International Journal of Molecular Sciences, very good scientific journal. So what we did, we took antibodies made against different thyroid hormones and reacted them with toxic chemicals. This is some kind of indirect way to see how much toxic chemicals, when bind to human tissue proteins, can change our tissue proteins to look like thyroid hormones from the structure point of view. So when we added antibody made against thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, it reacted with aflatoxin bound to human protein, formaldehyde, and isocyanate. That is very significant.
So tell everybody what the TSH receptor is so they understand, and what the impact of that might mean.
Well, on the thyrocytes, we have a receptor called thyroid stimulating hormone receptors, where it's important for binding of our hormone to that receptor in order to thyroid gland to function properly. So when the antibody, when we get exposed to these toxic chemicals, aflatoxin, isocyanate, formaldehyde, then we make these antibodies against these chemicals plus human tissue protein. Now these antibodies can turn, if they get to the thyroid gland, can bind to that receptor, and the hormones will not be able to bind to its own receptor, and therefore will interfere with the functionality of thyroid gland. The same thing we did with thyroid, the iodinase, and with T3 antibodies. And the name of the many chemicals that really reacted with that were many. Again, parabens, which is part of the, in many cosmetics, heavy metals, aflatoxin is again and again. So this is what we found, that many chemicals bind to human tissue proteins, albumin, hemoglobin, and we make antibodies against that. Now the antibodies, because the combination of toxic chemicals with human proteins look like that receptor and thyrocytes, the antibody, if gets to the tissue, in this case thyroid gland, can interfere with the binding of the hormone to its receptor, and therefore dysfunction of thyroid gland. So we may not have antibody against TG and TPO.
Right.
but you were exposed to toxic chemicals, and toxic chemicals through this mechanism will interfere with the binding of the hormone to its receptor.
And so when we're talking about this for the listener, and then the Cyrex has a test, and Dr. Vojdani's got multiple papers on this, and I don't know if we'll get to it today because we're about a quarter of the way through my notes, but the chemical could create a problem because the chemical creates inflammation, the inflammation creates damage, and there's multiple ways that a chemical could create a problem. But one of the things he's talking about, I think, here is especially that the chemicals by themselves may not drive an antibody response, drive your immune system to make an antibody against the chemicals. But if that chemical binds to a piece of your tissue, your body typically knows your tissue. It knows the chemical, but now when you put these two things together, we've created a new thing that we're not quite sure what it is. And the body says, whoa, I don't know what that is. You call it, or I think it's called a neoantigen, a new antigen. Right. And yes. Now your immune system reacts to this new antigen, but it also sees that the little piece of your tissue was on there, and that became part of what it recognizes. And so now it may start damaging your own tissue every time you're exposed to that chemical. Did I give that justice?
Yes, absolutely. So therefore, what do we learn from this? As part of treatment for patients at early stage of thyroiditis, you have to do detoxification. Try to get rid of the chemicals bound to human tissue. We call that body burden of toxic chemicals. And then after that, you have to minimize future exposure to toxic chemicals. Otherwise, this mechanism of action will continue. You get exposed to bisphenol A every day, right, and you drink your coffee in a plastic cup, and even microgram amount of that can interfere with your endocrine system. Unless you eliminate that, you are not going to see improvement in the clinical condition of your patient.
So let's tie that in for a listener, because they're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm exposed to chemicals everywhere, everything, PFAS, BPA, everything. Oh, and they can easily get overwhelmed. Like now they're in emotional chaos, emotional stress, because they're scared of everything in the environment. And that's not where we want them either, because the emotional stress of being so scared to death of every possible thing. But if you have an or an autoimmune condition or inflammatory condition, what I try and do with people, and you tell me if this is how you intended it, is that the things they need, I generally tell people, listen, clean up your diet, your lifestyle, get the cleaner products, go to ewg.org, get the cleaner version of your cleaning products, cleaner version of your deodorant, cleaner version of the things you do, and do your best. Don't do what I did in my house, which was sweep everything into the trash can and we're starting over. That creates like tears and chaos, right? But start making those changes and transitions. But for my clients, we've done a test when they're concerned about what should they take priority on. That's where we look at a test from Cyrex Labs. It's Cyrex Array 11 that looks at these chemicals that you're already having some loss of tolerance to with your immune system. So now your immune system is like anytime that chemical comes in, you have the potential to upregulate the immune system. And these become the things in your hierarchy of things that you need to spend more focus and time eliminating the exposure to them while we support the detoxification pathways. Is that fair?
Yes, very fair. Regarding the measurements, I would like to interject also that measuring chemicals, toxic chemicals in urine, and you have it at high level, it's not bad, it's good. Meaning your body have the capacity to detoxify and get rid of toxic chemicals.
Right.
Why am I saying that? Because all of us, to be honest with you, all of us, we are exposed to many toxic chemicals on a daily basis. I have concern about chemicals which are not detected in the urine, chemicals that bind to human tissue proteins and form neoantigen and therefore autoantibody production. Please go ahead.
I totally agree with you. And I make this point a lot of times. People are like, I want to be tested for toxicity. What chemicals I'm peeing out? Well, hey, if your body's peeing them out, that's part of your detoxification system. That's a good thing. I'm in with your camp. If I know you're exposed to stuff and nothing show up in your urine, I'm more concerned, right? Because something's not working. And we see this too, like mold. Urine test for mold toxins is a big testing in functional medicine space, and I'm not knocking it, but my issue with this, just like the chemicals, is the organisms we need to be exposed or concerned about isn't. You want to reduce your exposure. If you live in a really moldy environment, it's probably good to remediate that mold and clean it up. But we've been exposed to mold for, I don't know, a couple thousand years, right? So the issue becomes, which things am I concerned about? And that's where we can do it. Cyrex is array 12, and we take a look at the organisms that we've lost tolerance to, which now your immune system says, hey, every time I see that, that's an issue. And why that's important for mold, and you can correct me in a second, is that if two people could live in the same home, same exposure to mold, one seems perfectly healthy and the other one struggling with chronic illness, is it the mold, or is it one of those people has lost tolerance? What I want to know for that person is the mold the real issue that's created? Have they lost tolerance for it? Or are you just seeing mold and thinking, oh, that's my problem, and going down the wrong trail, right? Because if they're exposed to mold, it's going to show up in their urine potentially as the metabolites, but it may not be what's driving an excessive immune response.
Yes, I believe it is the immune system of two individuals makes huge difference, whether one is going to lose the tolerance mechanism and the other one will not do. And of course, two people can have different lifestyle as well. So all of those are the factors. Now, because we got into the world of pathogens, so let's stop talking about the chemicals. Is it clear that chemicals playing a significant role in autoimmunity through neoantigen formation, and therefore it is important to look at body burden of toxic chemicals and not chemicals in the urine? I'm one of those clearly saying that measuring mycotoxins in urine is a useless test. I'm saying this. I did a lot of work and I published many articles 20 years ago. It is important to measure antibodies against mycotoxin bound to human tissue antigens. So with that, if it's okay, let's move to the world of pathogens and their contribution to autoimmunity, particularly thyroid diseases. And for that, I have many, many articles, but I'm just very fast. Because
listen, if you're not in a rush, we're in no rush.
Okay.
So take your time and let's go through it.
So while we have so much information about the role of pathogens in autoimmunity, I think when I was in my graduate school in 1968, I came across this article at that time that someone published a few years before that about cross-reaction between streptococcus and heart tissue antigen and its role in autoimmunity against heart tissue. And I got I became very impressed with that. That was the first indication that pathogens play a significant role in autoimmunity. And since then, we have thousands and thousands of articles about mimicry or similarity between pathogens and human tissue. So let's start with this by saying that pathogens has been in this world millions, if not billions years ahead of us, before us. And to survive in their environment, especially in the human body, all the time they try to change their structure to become like human from structural point of view. Why is that? When SARS-CoV-2 changes the spike protein, and spike protein shares homology with more than 30 different tissue antigens, is doing that because to hide from the immune system and not to be attacked by the immune system. So the homology and mimicry between pathogens and human tissue, it's a scientific fact. And when you go online and you do search for mimicry between this and that, I assure you, if you choose, for example, Botox, especially I'm mentioning that, which is
you think I had a lot of Botox work?
No.
Hey, it's not that funny.
And which is produced by a bacteria. In my training, I was trained as a microbiologist. Then I became an immunologist. It's produced neurotoxin. Botox is neurotoxic. And then there is a lot of homology between that neurotoxin from Botox with thyroid tissue antigen. So here the list that I'm going to read. What pathogens so far clearly have significant homology? When I say significant homology, meaning many peptides with more than 40 to 100% homology with human tissue antigens. So number one, Clostridium botulinum. So that's one of them. Rickettsia, H. pylori, Borrelia burgdorferi, the agent of Lyme disease, Yersinia enterocolitica, Toxoplasma, and I'm mentioning two in here that we may talk about it some other time, Bifidobacteria and Lactobacillus.
So tell everybody why those last two are really important, because when you say pathogen, right, people might consume it's an organism that shouldn't be in the body, and that's why it creates a problem. But explain what lactobacillus and bifidobacterium often are. And we're talking, these are broad categories. This is like saying, Joe Smith, because there's lots of them.
Bacteria in this case, I'm sorry, you should not classify those under pathogens.
But they're bacteria that primarily are in your body. These things are things that are, let's say technically in the body, right? They're in the GI tract. These are like primary commensal bacteria of your GI tract. Your probiotics are often loaded with lactobacillus and bifidobacteria.
So since we are talking about that, there are several publications that show these two bacteria, Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus, of course, different strains.
Right.
Shared between 41 to 45% similarity with thyroid tissue, thyroglobulin and thyroid peroxidase. Now, I do take probiotics every day, but that doesn't mean taking that probiotic is going to affect my thyroid gland. Why is that? Because, first of all, let's establish that if I take probiotic every day, meaning when the probiotic is not going to be implanted in my gut. if it was going to be implanted, then why do I need to take them every day?
Right.
So they get destroyed, but they release some beneficial factors, which is good for the immune system. These probiotics will affect my thyroid gland if during that process that bacteria get killed in the gut by the acids in the stomach, the proteins will not be digested. And that protein that cross-react with thyroid tissue will get into the blood if I have leaky gut syndrome. If I don't have leaky gut syndrome, there is no way that will get into my blood. Even if it will get into my blood, I'll make antibodies. Unless these antibodies will get into my thyroid gland, is not going to affect my thyroid. So therefore, yes, we are talking about mimicry and antigenic similarity, but that doesn't mean when we get infected with all these 18 different pathogens and bacteria and viruses that I'm reading, that doesn't mean we are going to have thyroid autoimmunity because of that. Only an individual which is having leaky gut, leaky blood-brain barriers, let's call it leaky thyroid, then these pathogens going to contribute to thyroid autoimmunity. Let's make that clear in here.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because there's people that get infections all the time. There's people take probiotics all the time, and it's not triggering an autoimmune condition. It's not like just because you get a H. pylori infection, you're going to have autoimmunity. It's really about, we go back to this before, what's the state of my immune system? Because can my immune system, is it in a position where it's actually regulating itself well, where it could say, hey, I got this. I understand what that is. Let's just get rid of that thing, but not have a different response. There's the piece of molecular mimicry. There's a bunch of other potential things that, we talk about what are the hypotheses for autoimmunity. I think there's 7, 8, maybe 9 of those at this point, maybe a few more. But for the listeners, when he's talking about molecular mimicry, like the amino acid structure, so protein, peptide, amino acid, those amino acids are stacked up, and they look, the sequence of those amino acids that make up the peptide of maybe that organism look very similar to, say, the thyroid protein. And so an immune system that's maybe struggling a little bit may say, you know what, that thing's close enough. The analogy I often give is if you were, let's say you were married to a set of identical twins, and one day you guys decide to go out to the bar, and it's dark in the bar, you had a couple drinks, both of the brothers, let's say you're a female and your brothers both go into the bathroom, they're dressed identical, and one of them comes out, it's dark, you've had a couple cocktails, and you kiss the wrong brother. Is it really your fault, right? I mean, what are you going to do, right? And so this can happen to the immune system as well. And Dr. Vojdani may say, no, that's totally a terrible analogy, but the immune system, if it sees a pretty similar peptide structure or amino acid sequence, it might start to say, you know what, we've got a problem going on here. I'm not quite sure what it is, but that thing looks pretty close to the thing I was told is a problem. I'm going to go after that thing. Is that? And
I have an example of that right here. Let me see if you can.
No, you're kind of blanked out with your backdrop. Nope. Go down. Okay. Yeah, I think it's hard to show because your screen thing is doing it.
Okay. So anyway, there are mimicry between different bacteria, viruses, parasites with human tissue. I read all the way to lactobacillus, then treponema, which is the agent of syphilis, right?
What did you say it was?
Treponema.
Yeah.
Pallidum. Yeah. Candida albicans.
Yeast. So for women, that's a type of yeast that can create a problem that they probably know of.
Yes. cytomegalovirus,
Huh. Everybody had some exposure to CMV, right?
Epstein-Barr virus.
No way,
Yes.
Epstein-Barr,
Oh,
huh?
yeah. It's in fact, it has many peptides that cross-react with human tissue. Then another one that many people do not pay attention, which is detected in drinking water. It's called Mycobacterium avium. It's not from the same family of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, or BCG is another one. But this is Mycobacterium avium. It's involved in thyroid autoimmunity. Chlamydia pneumoniae, which has a peptide called heat shock protein, or a protein called heat shock protein 60 that cross-react with human heat shock protein 60. Bartonella, which is co-infection of Lyme disease. Human herpes type 6, very much involved in thyroid autoimmunity. Hepatitis C, and the last one, which is total 18 of them that I read, is SARS-CoV-2, which cross-react with both thyroglobulin and thyroid peroxidase. And so that is really a good summary of what I have in here.
So I think what's kind of important there too is for a lot of listeners there, they might listen to a podcast or read somebody's blog post and they talk about Epstein-Barr virus is the thing that causes thyroiditis, or this infection is the thing. It's not necessary. I mean, all of them could potentially be triggers. So that's where we have to do our due diligence to say, look, it could be Epstein-Barr, but everybody's had some exposure, but could it be that that's an issue? It could be, right? But it's not that all of them are caused, everybody's thyroiditis is caused by it. I want to ask you a question in regard to a potential mechanism to trigger thyroiditis. We know the thyroid gland cells have toll-like receptors on them. These are little receptors. So when a cell is damaged, let's say there's a bacteria, there's a virus in it, there's a toxin, something damages the cell in danger releases things called PAMPs. These are pathogen-associated molecular peptides. These are essentially what the cell is doing. It releases these DAMPs and PAMPs and other signaling chemicals to say to the immune system, hey, immune system, DAMPs kind of tell the immune system, I'm the tissue being damaged, come help me. And a PAMP is a piece of the organism, and they throw that out into the bloodstream to say to the immune system, hey, this is the thing that's creating a problem, go find it and get rid of it. But the thyroid cells also have receptors for DAMPs and PAMPs. So my thought process is that, based on a bunch of papers that I've read, is that the thyroid has danger receptors, right? And I don't think, at least initially, that what we see oftentimes at the thyroid gland and the change in thyroid physiology is broken physiology at the onset, especially, and I think the same along with the immune system. It's not broken, but adaptive, and that the immune system is trying to protect us from something. And I think our cellular physiology is trying to protect us from something, because if I'm a cell perceiving danger, I want to shift from manufacturing to cell defense. How do I do it? I downregulate the amount of T3 inside the cell. That turns down the manufacturing process. And by having less T3 inside the cell, it allows for some of those cell defense mechanisms to kick on, right? It also downregulates the mitochondria. So I'm allowed some oxidative stress, but not excessive. So I don't just damage the cell from excessive oxidative stress. But if those DAMPs and PAMPs start to build up and in circulation, could they not just trigger bind to those thyroid cells themselves? And in their binding, and there's been a bunch of papers that talk about how the thyroid cells themselves can initiate the immune response. And what that means to the listener, the thyroid cells then start releasing inflammatory chemicals, cytokines out into the system. They can become immune-like, without the immune system there initially, and it's their signaling molecules that then invite those lymphocytes in because they're looking for the threat or the damage. And could there be an initial benefit here? And if you think about it, if I'm one cell and I'm feeling a threat, I turn down the metabolism locally. If I'm one tissue, maybe I downregulate the metabolism locally. But if it's chronic, excessive exposure, what's the best way to turn down the overall metabolism is to downregulate the gland that actually produces it. Have you considered that or had any thoughts on that?
One good example will be that the thyroid cells could produce heat shock proteins, 60. And when they release that, we make antibody against the heat shock protein 60 of the thyroid, which cross-react with human heat shock protein 60. Lipopolysaccharide by the bacteria could bind to those toll-like receptors and cause damage to the thyroid cells. So you have more knowledge about that than me in regards of this subject, and so go ahead and explain it more for us.
But I think one of the keys is when we're talking about that is we often look at what goes on with the physiology and we say, oh, it's broken physiology. My immune system's out of control, right? But I think we don't give the physiology enough credit. I don't think it's always an immune system out of control initially. The immune system is trying to protect, right? So in time, it can become this plasticized imbalance, right? But the initial thing is not typically an immune system that just all of a sudden one day decided, hey, I'm going to start attacking tissue. I just, for the intelligence that's within our physiology that we still don't even fully understand, I find it hard to believe that one day you wake up and your immune system says, that's it, I forgot that all of this stuff is part of the person's physiology. It's all foreign and I need to go after it. I think initially the immune system is probably starting out as an adaptive defensive mechanism. And unfortunately, as we said, if that load that their exposome is constant and chronic and unrelenting, then the immune system starts getting plasticized and shifted into this dysregulated mode. And unfortunately, it does create pathology and disease.
So because so many pathogens, this is a list of 18 that I found, involved in thyroid autoimmunity and many other autoimmune diseases, we have to look for these pathogens, and if the patient makes antibody against these pathogens, then we should do something about it. For example, if we take Epstein-Barr virus, Epstein-Barr virus peptide becomes citrunylated for some reason. So when the person is having EBV and certain proteins become citrunylated, isn't that a mechanism for production of anti-citrunylated antibody production, which is involved in rheumatoid arthritis?
Right.
And so we have to find the root cause. And if we find it, if it's Epstein-Barr virus, we have to empower the immune system in order to keep those viruses inside the B cell and not to become reactivated.
So that's a great question. People think about Epstein-Barr and other viruses like, hey, I get it, I kill it, it's gone. So there's a couple of states, maybe we can talk about this a little bit. You can have a dead virus, right? Or a dead organism. You can have a dormant organism. You can have a latent organism, and you can have a reactivating or replicating organism. Can you explain the difference and what we should be concerned about out of those four options?
I think we should have significant concern about dormant viruses, meaning they almost all children, as a child, we get exposed to both EBV and HHV6, human herpes type 6. I think EBV is type 4. We get exposed more than 95% of the population, and then cause maybe a little bit problem, and then the virus goes inside the B cells and stays in a dormant situation. As long as the immune system is strong, no problem. As soon as we are stressed, the exposome factors and all of that, the virus becomes reactivated and releasing new antigens, such as early antigen. And then the body makes antibody against that, and those antibodies cross-react with human tissue, resulting in many autoimmunities. It is quite interesting. We can learn from why the dormant viruses are so important. We can learn from long COVID. It was shown in a couple articles that when the SARS-CoV-2 get into human tissue, really the spike protein is not 100% fit with ACE2 receptor. It is probably 70% fit. And so therefore, only when dormant virus such as EBV and HHV6 become reactivated for other reasons, or to begin with, the person is having reactivated EBV or HHV6 and unknown other viruses, then that changes the pathophysiology of the cell, and now the ACE2 receptor changes in such a way the hand and glove would fit 100% instead of 70%. And therefore, the SARS-CoV-2 will infect an individual with reactivated EBV and HHV6 with higher rate than individual who doesn't have EBV and HHV6 reactivation. That's why we have to keep those viruses, if they are dormant, we have to keep them dormant by strengthening the immune system. When we have a virus get into our body and we know that we have the virus and we can do something about that. But dormant viruses, in my opinion, they're more dangerous than other in different phase of other viruses.
Where's latent infections or latent virus organisms fit into that?
Meaning the virus just got into our body very recent.
So is there a difference between the replicating or latent phase?
Depends on the strength of the immune system. I gave the example of SARS-CoV-2, the IRS that infect, replicate, and spread.
Right.
So some infect, depend on the strength of the immune system, will stay at that level. No harm is done. But as soon as the virus gets replicated from 2 to 4 and then millions, then can spread from one cell to another cell and therefore serious viral infection.
So what do you see as the best things that somebody who's listening to this when they're thinking about, man, I've had Epstein-Barr, I've had some of these infections in the past, what do I do? What can they do to limit the possibility of these dormant infections? And for the listener, think like Sleeping Beauty is sleeping, right? And then the prince comes in and kisses her and activates her, right? That's what he's kind of talking about. You have Epstein-Barr that's dormant in the cell. It's not really bugging anybody. And then all of a sudden you have enough stress, there's fuel, that virus starts, woo, time to go. and now there's fuel and it stays active. The issue is, and for the listener, think about like a cold sore. You get emotionally stressed out, or you get sunburn, you create tissue damage. That tissue damage allows for that virus to become reactivated, right? It goes from dormant to active, and now you see the impact of it. About 7 to 10 days, your immune system gets it all under control, and it puts that organism back into dormancy. The virus didn't really go anywhere. You still have it. That's why it can fire back up again. The issue is that sometimes those viruses stay in that active state, and they can create a problem. But what can we do to keep those organisms in sleeping beauty status versus active status?
I will call it very simple. Minimize the exposome factor and keep your immune system strong through good lifestyle. That includes everything.
And I know that's not sexy. Somebody's looking and going, couldn't you just tell me which supplement to take, right? Can't you just tell me which food not to eat? Can't you just give me the simple answer? And the answer is no. No. This is why when he's talking about the exposome and the impact it has, this is why when you just go gluten-free and you already have an upregulated immune system, it may have a little bit of an effect, or it may have a huge effect. It may or may not. It all depends. It's like throwing the life raft off the Titanic. The boat is still sinking. Now, how big of an impact it's going to have is, did you get into the life raft or did you not get into that life raft, right? But yes. So you have to, instead of being micro-focused on individual things, the best set I think we can leave the listeners with is, improve your physical fitness, improve your dietary fitness, improve your respiratory fitness, improve your sleep fitness, improve your environmental fitness, both internal, external, right? Improve your habits, right? Do everything you can to raise your level of health or fitness in each of these areas. And that's the best way you're going to hold them off. Supplements are a great tool to help us improve, but they're not the long-term strategy. You have to improve diet and lifestyle. And even though you've had a load over 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I think people get concerned that, hey, how am I ever can I recover, right? From your experience, when we talk about people with autoimmune conditions and loss of tolerance, can they regain tolerance to some of these things? And can they improve their immune system?
The answer is yes. And that's why I would like to get to the third issue of food and its contribution to healthy immune system.
Let's do it.
Okay. So let me share with you this article first, that published in a journal called Nutrients. Again, very good scientific journal. And the title is Dietary Factors Associated with Plasma Thyroid Peroxidase and Thyroglobulin Antibodies. Okay, so what they say, animal fat, butter, associated with positive plasma levels of thyroid autoantibodies.
So that doesn't sound good for the carnivore or the keto person.
Okay. Yes. Vegetables, as well as dietary groups with high consumption of fruits, nuts, and fiber, are associated with negative finding of TPO and TG autoantibodies. And the difference between the levels of these two groups was statistically highly significant. So from that, I would like to take you to another article, which is called Immunodietica. Beautiful name, isn't it?
Yeah. Did you come up with that one?
Dietica.
Okay.
a data-driven approach to investigate interactions between diet and autoimmune disorders. This article was written by two scientists from UC San Francisco, where they looked at foods being more or less autoimmunogenics. Guess what? When they looked at fruits, vegetables, nuts, fish, red meat, and all of that, they came out with an index. And the index is under name of Gerstein and Ferreira, GF. This is not gluten-free. Okay, GF factor. And the highest GF factor was found in pork.
Interesting.
Let's say 1,000. In red meat, beef, and others, around 200, 250 units. Fish, around 100, 150. Nuts, fruits, and vegetables, around 20, 30, 40. Therefore, first of all, two conclusions at the end. For individuals with autoimmunity should go on vegetarian or vegan diet. Based on that, secondly, they say, we wonder how come in some religions pork is forbidden? That is in the article.
Well, I don't know
Not
that
to make this political or
yeah, but I don't. But obviously, maybe there's something to it, right? But they didn't have obviously those studies when they decided that pork was against the religion. But I guess the argument to that would be from the carnivore community who you've had a lot of people with chronic immune and autoimmune conditions have gone to a carnivore diet and really seen their health turn around, right? So how would we, if we're saying that, right? And I mean, I don't disagree with what you've stated, but if I'm the person who's sitting back saying, whoa, I had autoimmune issues and I went carnivore and I did better, how would we explain that?
I really don't know how to explain that other than let's say an individual is having certain diet. We know that the diet is affecting our gut microbiome, right? One of the reasons that people go on gluten-free diet and the first few weeks they see some positive or some even negative, some people, results is because they're changing the gut microbiome. And these individuals, they change drastically. Mm-hmm. Now they consume so much meat, they change their gut microbiome. And in some individual, maybe that gut microbiome is helpful. So this article, in my opinion, is just one article. Mm-hmm. And it's not 100% that I'm going to recommend to everybody. For some people, maybe high diet with high amount of red meat will be helpful. For the others, vegetarian will be helpful.
And I think that goes back to personalized medicine, right? And I think that it'd be for us in general in functional medicine, I think we do a disservice to our community to some degree, because sometimes we have the community, these micro communities inside the functional medicine community saying vegan is better than keto, keto is better than paleo, paleo is better than carnivore, and we're vilifying whole food, non-processed, often non-GMO organic foods, and we've circled the wagons and we're shooting in. Instead, we should be looking out and saying, hey, the processed food that contains all the pesticides and the chemicals and the other things are the things we should be more concerned about, because if we have a more whole food, healthy diet, right, that's where we could say at any point in our journey, we might need that rapid change, or changing our food changes the biome, and that might help us to be a vegetarian or vegan for a period of time. But if we do that too long, that could be problematic. So let's switch back to a different type of whole food diet versus, hey, we spend so much time arguing about which whole food diet's right, and we totally ignore the fact that people are consuming massive quantities of processed food, which is probably the bigger issue.
Yes. So the last part I would like to emphasize is the food that cross-react with thyroid tissue. That's the work that was done in my laboratory. We started 5 years ago with Dr. Karazian, still continues. I continue this type of research. And just let me read that the food that cross-reacted with if we take, for example, just wheat germ agglutinin,
which is a component of wheat for those who are unfamiliar.
So one of the main reasons really I included wheat germ agglutinin as part of the array 11 was because I knew, or I found, that wheat germ agglutinin contributes to many autoimmunity as well as other lectins and agglutinins. In general, I don't want to conclude that the doctor who wrote the book, I forgot his name, about lectins and agglutinins, and he claims that every human being should be on lectin-free diet. I'm only saying that if you react to lectins, such as wheat germ agglutinin, soy agglutinin, peanut agglutinin, then you may consider removing that from your diet, because antibody against lectins and agglutinins contributes to autoimmunity. Here, example, this is from my book, but it's from the original article. Antibody against wheat germ agglutinin reacts with ASCA and ANCA. Meaning,
so let people know what that is.
Yeah, actually, it's better to say that SCA and NCA. It's Saccharomyces, ASCA stands for antibody to Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody, that yeast in general. ANCA is anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibodies. Earlier, we were talking about neutrophils, lymphocyte, monocyte. And so neutrophils in the gut, when become activated, they release calprotectin and other factors which cause inflammation in the gut and contributes to autoimmunity. So wheat germ agglutinin antibody cross-react with that, with zonulin, which is tight junction proteins, with tau protein involved in Alzheimer's, thyroid peroxidase, which is involved in thyroid autoimmunity, with ovary, endocrine, insulin and islet cells, and dopamine receptors. So that's just one subject. When we took antibodies against T3, reacted that with 200 foods. These are the food that reacted to roasted almonds. And this is important because some individual may react to roasted almond, but not to raw almonds. And that's the heart of the matter in array 10. Why we measure antibodies against raw versus cooked food or modified food. If we consume food in the raw form, we have to measure antibody against raw form. If we consume food in cooked for, we have to measure antibody against that. But other than Cyrex, nobody is measuring antibodies against modified food. They buy the antigens from different sources, which is made from raw food antigen. So therefore, if your test is positive or negative at Cyrex for certain food, that will be the answer, because at Cyrex, measuring antibodies against raw and modified food.
So can I jump in there for a sec? So for the listener, one of the things that we're talking about here is he's talking about when you eat a food, especially if you don't break that food down into the amino acids and you just have the peptides and those undigested peptides, if your immune system reacts to them because they're crossing the barrier or because you just have an upregulated immune system, then the body is saying, hey, I'm going to react every time I see something that looks like this peptide. This is the twin scenario, right? So, hey, I see this. And some of these foods that you can lose tolerance to may cross-react with your thyroid tissue, right? Your enzymes in the thyroid, and it could react with the T4 and T3 that you're taking. So you might have this upregulated immune system. You're taking thyroid hormone. You're like, hey, I don't think it's working. Well, one of the reasons it may not be working is maybe because your immune system is reacting to that hormone. Is that possible?
Yes, very well said. Very well said. And so these are the foods: almond, roasted amaranths, buckwheat, milk, coffee, hemp, kamut, which is wheat, latex heavy, that's a very allergen in latex, mustard seeds, oats, and egg yolk, not egg white. Antibody against T4 reacted again with both raw and roasted almond, Brussels sprouts, Brazil nuts, cashew, clam, gelatin, macadamia nuts, oats, mustard seeds again, and egg yolk. So you see, there is some overlap between T3 and T4, which shows really the accuracy of what we measure.
So even if we look at that from if you're a person who's saying, hey, my T4, T3 in my bloodstream looks okay when they tested it, but I still feel hypothyroid, not only one of the things we have to consider is, could you be eating foods that are producing cross-reactive antibodies that are damaging those things, and they're not getting into the cell or tissue? That's why it becomes really important. When I saw this on the array test for the first time, I was like, oh man, this adds a whole nother level to what's going on with somebody.
Yes. So then when we took thyroid peroxidase antibodies, reacted with about 200 foods, lentil lectin, mushrooms that we use, some of them for enhancing immune function, pea lectins, and you see lectins all the time, seaweed, apricot, cod, fish, wheat germ agglutinin. Again, the highest reaction was wheat germ agglutinin. So this is about cross-reaction between thyroid tissue antibodies with different food antigens. And also we did reverse in another study. We took food antibodies, reacted with tissue antigens, and we found thyroglobulin, and especially thyroid peroxidase, was highly, highly reactive with lectins and agglutinins, particularly wheat germ agglutinin and soy agglutinin, bean agglutinins. So if really you have thyroid autoimmunity, or you are at early stage of thyroid autoimmunity, I highly recommend, first of all, to take care of your gut and make sure you do not suffer from leaky gut syndrome. And secondly, if you suffer from leaky gut syndrome, definitely you should remove lectins and agglutinins and other thyroid cross-reactive foods from your diet.
So let me jump in there and talk about, we're talking about, Cyrix Labs has a test called Array 10. It tests all these foods for potential reactivity. Now there's some louder voices in the functional medicine space that say food sensitivity or food intolerance testing is not accurate, doesn't mean anything. You shouldn't get it done. It's a waste of money. What makes what you're doing different, or why might those opinions not be appropriate? And I understand where people get, they're like, hey, I got this testing done and I don't eat any of those foods. And so I don't understand why I'm reacting. Therefore it's invalid. How would you answer those?
I do not blame the functional medicine community to come to that conclusion. In fact, if you look at my book, and the first chapter of the book or second chapter of the book, I devoted to this issue of why we should not call IgG or IgA antibody measurement as food allergy. Because you see so many patients come with the test results of IgG antibodies and say, I have allergy to so many foods, and my doctor told me to remove that from my diet. First of all, there is problem with laboratory testing. If right now you take one blood sample and split it between 5 different laboratories, would they do food IgG or IgA testing? I promise you that you are going to get 5 different results. And I discussed that in that chapter in my book. Why? If you expect reproducibility, you can expect that only if the laboratory is using the same antigen, the same methodology, the same process from A to Z. Only then you can compare one lab to another lab. And because there are 5, you get 5 different results, doctors in functional medicine, they say this test is useless. So I don't blame them. I did write extensively about this. Let me just give you one example, and Jim and we should respond to this doctor. This doctor did a test for thyroglobulin antibody. By Cyrix, it was low positive. Then they did test another lab, let's say LabCorp, and it was negative. And he really wants an answer. Why a test in one lab is positive, in another lab is negative? So we have to answer that, Jim and I. But I would like to refer that doctor to a page that we get 4 times a year from the Survey of College of American Pathologists for thyroglobulin antibodies and thyroid peroxidase antibodies. Many times you see that a test was done by one method is completely negative, by another method is completely positive. And I'm talking about the College of American Pathologists survey of thousands of laboratories. The same thing when we check for PSA. PSA in one lab could be 2 and another lab could be 5. That's why laboratories, when they do testing, they should mention by what method the test was performed. And then from that, we go back to what antigen they use. Did they use synthetic antigen? Did they use peptide? Did they use impure antigen? Did they use pure antigen? So back to the issue of food sensitivity. Food intolerance, I can accept that. Why? Because when our tolerance mechanisms break down, we react to food. And I gave example of peanuts contaminated with mycotoxin or aflatoxin. Yes, in that case, our tolerance mechanism breaks down, and then we can say, yes, you have a reaction to this food and that food because your tolerance mechanism is broken. But I tried with my book completely to turn around and say, hey, we are interested in IgG and IgA antibodies. Because if I make antibody against Weger-agglutinin, that doesn't mean I have allergy or sensitivity to Weger-agglutinin. But antibody against Weger-agglutinin, if I have leaky gut syndrome, can turn around and attack my thyroid tissue and result in thyroid autoimmunity. So that's why at Cyrex, we are interested in contribution of food in the form of raw and modified to autoimmunity, and we stay away from allergies and hypersensitivities due to food if IgG or IgA antibody is elevated. So that's why my book is about food-associated autoimmunities. Not about allergy, not about hypersensitivity.
And so I want to add to that for the listener. I think you did a nice job of saying, and we see this from lab to lab. That's why when I see somebody, when they're going to just LabCorp or Quest back and forth getting the thyroid panel done or getting any labs done, we could see a big change on this a day apart, right? And it's due to methodology, different labs, reference ranges change. So that's why you want to be pretty consistent. You want to know how things are tested, that part. But I think the other piece there that's really important that some labs don't do is what Cyrex does is they actually put the common cross-reactive foods, because what people do is they'll say, hey, I've never eaten that food. I don't understand how I could have an immune response to it. And usually what I'll do then is say, hey, let's look at the text sheet of what known cross things this food cross reacts with. You may not be eating that food, but what you might be eating is one that often cross reacts. Is that a potential factor as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One more thing I would like to add, it is not enough we have so many problems with food allergy and sensitivity, according to the other labs. They are adding another factor to that, and that is blood spot testing for antibodies. Do you know that in the laboratory settings, if serum is hemolyzed, if we get hemolyzed blood right now in my lab for any testing for antibodies, we are rejecting that and we ask for another blood draw. So my question is, for blood spot, you hemolyze the blood and then you use hemolyzed blood for testing antibodies. One, you have problem with hemolyzed blood. Secondly, you have problem with accurate measurements. How can you measure accurately the amount of blood in that spot? That is a huge problem. So I'm, they're adding a little bit more gasoline to the fire by applying these type of unaccepted methodologies for a test, which is not only it's not enough, it's not reproducible. In 5 different laboratories, now they're adding another variable to the methodology. I agree with serum being separated from blood and testing for antibodies by the method that I believe it's almost greater than 90% reproducible. And hopefully one day, laboratories will get together and say, listen, let's get together and use the same antigen, use the same methodology, and then offer this to our colleagues in functional medicine, and hopefully our test results will be reproducible one laboratory to another laboratory. Until then, I sincerely believe, not only because the test was developed by me, the most reliable test for measuring food antibody testing is Cyrex Laboratories.
Yeah, and I think what we have to help somebody understand here is, so the quality of the test, how it's done, the way it's performed, the type of antigen, all these things are really important. And to take this back to something that people use all the time is supplements. Just because you buy a digestive enzyme from one company doesn't mean it's the same quality as the digestive enzyme you get from another company, because of the purity, the level of toxicity. I don't think people realize that sometimes some of the base products that are used to make the supplements that we take every day to help us become less toxic, themselves may be highly toxic in the way they're produced or generated. So just like every digestive enzyme or every antibiotic or probiotic isn't the same, all the testing has different methodologies in the way they're performed in different standards. So I agree with a lot of what you just said there.
For every test that, whether it's done at Cyrex or other laboratories, but at least at Cyrex, I know we adhere to these 4 core principles of laboratory testing. Number one, the most important, is the purity of the antigen that you are using in the test. As always, I say, test as good as the purity of the antigen. Even your antigen is pure, you have to standardize the test. What dilution, how much of the antigen you have to add, optimize it, optimization of the test before introducing it into the market. I highly recommend tests to be in duplicates, because if you do it once, there is a probability of mistake. When you do it in duplicates, you can catch even 1% mistake. You can catch that and repeat the test. And finally, it is required tests to be validated before its introduction. So that is, all of that is done at Cyrex. And one of the reasons it takes us such a long time, for example, for Array 10, it took us 3 years development of doing all those 4, to have all those 4 core principles in the place. Array 3 for gluten and associated celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It took me 2 years to develop that. So then suddenly you see a laboratory comes along, in less than 3 months, introduces the same test, or me too test, try to do similar tests. So I'm sitting down and watching and asking, how is it possible in 3 months laboratory to come out with a similar test that Cyrex is doing? Took me 2 years in one case, 3 to 4 years in another case to develop. I have no way to come to conclusion that they did the shortcut. They never adhered to those 4 core principles of laboratory testing, which is required for reliable reporting a laboratory test.
Awesome. Well, if you'll let me, I want to ask one more question, then we're going to finish up. We're already a bit longer than we anticipated, but it's been so good. We talk about this concept of loss of tolerance. And so the big thing that a lot of people ask is, I'm gluten intolerant, I'm dairy intolerant, I've taken an Array 10 and I see that I'm reactive to a bunch of different foods. or I've lost tolerance to toxins or organisms. Can somebody regain tolerance to a food that they've lost tolerance to, an organism maybe that they're reactive to? What would you say to that?
First of all, I will say to that person, make sure your test was done in a laboratory and you got reliable test results. If you got reliable test results, the answer is yes, you can regain your tolerance mechanism by, number one, introducing the same food highly diluted under the tongue. And even this works for food IgE testing, which is, that's why the company came out with peanuts and egg and few others. They give you very diluted amount of each food, and you take first a very low concentration and slowly increase concentration until you gain your tolerance mechanism back to normal. That's exactly what that company is doing for peanut allergy, egg allergy, soy allergy. So yes, it is possible. And what is the mechanism? Empowering the Treg cells to function again and maintain the balance between Th1 and Th2.
So, but are they, do we need to do more than just take small amounts to it? We also need to do some other things, like if they have a compromised gut, if they have dysbiosis, if they have chronic stress, we need to address those things as well along the way.
All the above. I agree with all the above. For classical allergy, that is what is done, and we can learn from that. For others, definitely, we have to do all the above to support the gut, to support the Treg cells in the gut, to repair damaged barriers, and then prevent entry of antigens into the circulation.
Right. So I think for the listener, I think this, instead of living in fear that, oh my gosh, I can never eat this, I can never eat that, I'm going to be down to a 1 or 2 foods, that's all I'll ever be able to eat. That's not good either, because the more restrictive you come with your diet, the more likely you are to have, and especially if you've got digestive issues, that you're going to react to the foods you're eating most often. You're not digesting them. Now you're reacting to the food. So I think what's really important here is that we do our best to address root causes, improve our fitness factors to improve those things. And there's going to be a bunch of things. I tell my clients, like, food intolerances are like people intolerances. There's some people in your life that you're going to develop an intolerance for, right? And given enough time, 5 years goes by, you're going to be like, why did I stop talking to Joe? I kind of like Joe. Why did I stop tolerating it? Why, what happened? But then you're going to have other people that you're like, Mary, I didn't like Mary before. I don't tolerate Mary now. When Mary walks in the room, I have a problem. So there may be things that you may continue to have some reactivity to, but the goal for, at least for me in functional medicine, is to try and improve reduce the triggers as much as possible. We got to identify them, and that's where Cyrex comes in to help us identify some of the things you've lost tolerance to, reduce or eliminate them as much as possible, support the recovery of the immune system and of the compromised systems so we can get back to homeostatic regulation, and then support the tissue repair, recovery, and regeneration. And when we do that, we start to have a restoration of tolerance to our things in our environment, and we're more adaptable, right?
Beautiful. Very, very well said. I do summarize that in 3 words. Detect, of course, by reliable method, remove, and repair.
Now
Detect,
you're just showing off.
remove,
Now you're
and
just
repair.
showing off.
So you have been a great host. Thank you so much for all of this. And please continue.
So what can I finish? If people want to know more about you, your book, the work that's being done at Cyrex Labs, where can they get more information? Where would you steer them?
I will give the microphone to Jim.
Thank you, Dr. Vojdani and Dr. Belkavich. So one of the great places for people to go is to the joincyrex.com website. And we also have a second website that's devoted to the lymphocyte map, that is lymphocytemap.com. And so those are really good resources. And for your providers, Dr. Belkavich's clients and everyone, of course, he knows how to get hold of us. And so those are really good educational sites. And so we hope that we'll take your questions, or you can also submit questions to Cyrex via those sites, and we will get back to you.
Yeah, and I'll say definitely for the practitioners, because they're going to have more access to this. The Cyrex Labs has fantastic educational information. You can go on, watch the videos. I've watched most of them 3 or 4 times at this point. Great, plenty of papers, plenty of literature and research. I'll ask Jim, where do you have a paper for that? He's more than willing to shoot me over more in a paper or two. I know most people maybe are not as annoying as I am, but I like to know the stuff. So I think it's huge. There's a great educational opportunity there, but we've taken a ton of time. I'll put some links to Cyrex Labs. I so much appreciate you guys coming on the podcast and giving us some information. Jim, you've given us so much information today. You've given us some. I got to switch the credit back to Dr. V. That was a joke.
I would like to add. Thank you so much. I would like to add also, I spent really significant amount of time to write 2 different documents for each test. One is clinical application guide. The other one is clinical interpretation guide. At least we wrote that for lymphocyte map and for Alzheimer's, links, and some other tests as well. So please go online and find those documents and read them and educate yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because a test is only really beneficial if you can interpret it and then know what to do as a result. It's one of the things I kind of beat up Jim on initially when I think when the lymphocyte test came out. I said, hey, this is fantastic, but we need to make sure that we understand, okay, now what do I do with it? And I was probably a thorn in Jim's side, maybe your side too, saying, hey, but what are the things we can do? What are the better tools to help shorten that time frame for the practitioner? Not everybody likes to look at all the sciencey, geeky stuff. Some people are like, just help me out and give me some initial stuff. And you guys have done a great job in putting that stuff together. So again, I appreciate you coming on. I'd love to have you back on. I got 5 pages left of questions. I could do this all day, but we're already an hour over, so we'll be respectful of your time. So for the listeners, this is one you're going to probably want to listen to a couple times. This is a real treat and a privilege to have Dr. Vojdani on. And at some point, we'll hope to have him back on. Guys, have a fantastic day. And listeners, get this out. Share this message with your friends and family. Yep. You want more?
I would like to say the final words that Dr. Belkavich, you were so good that honestly, I did not feel that how hour and a half time passed by. I could sit down and talk to you for hours. And so thank you for that.
Well, you got it. That was 2.5 hours. So we did fantastic. So it went by even faster.
Exactly. Thank you, Dr. Belkavich. Thank you, Dr.
Oh my God, it's 2 hours and a half?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.